February 1944. The hills of central Italy lie draped in mist and cordite. A pale sun rises over broken olive trees, glinting off spent shell casings scattered across the damp soil. From a shattered farmhouse wall, a single American sergeant crouches low, mud streaking his helmet. His squad number's barely a dozen now, tired eyes scanning the ridgeline ahead. Somewhere beyond that fog sits an entire company of Axis infantry. 200 men entrenched, rifles poised. The sergeant adjusts the straps on a battered field radio. The set crackles but emits no voice, only static. Its antenna hangs bent, snapped in half during the last barrage. He studies it, breath steady, mind racing. Around him, men whisper, "No ammunition left worth counting. Communications cut. Reinforcements out of reach." He glances again toward the valley. In that silence he begins speaking, calmly, deliberately, into the useless radio handset. His voice carries just far enough for enemy ears. And at that moment, the line between fear and surrender begins to blur. By early 1944, the war in Italy had become a brutal chess game fought yard by yard. After the landings in Sicily and then at Salerno, the Allies had pushed northward, expecting swift collapse of Axis resistance. Instead, they met stone. Ancient mountains turned into fortresses. The German High Command had fortified ridge after ridge, culminating in the Gustav Line, anchored at Cassino, with walls of concrete and artillery barrels hidden among monasteries and vineyards. For the Allied infantrymen, the geography itself was an enemy. Valleys funneled fire, narrow mule tracks swallowed trucks, and fog often erased any sense of direction. Supply convoys struggled to move an inch under constant shelling. Units were separated by ravines so deep that an order shouted across could fade before reaching the next platoon. Radios became the lifeline, but also the greatest vulnerability. The standard field radio of the American forces was the SCR-300, introduced only months before. It was heavier than promised, more than 30 pounds, but offered flexibility the troops had never known. For the first time, a battalion could talk directly to its forward squads without laying cables. Yet under rain, mud, and shell fire, these sets broke easily. When their fragile antennas snapped, range dropped from miles to mere yards. The men joked that sometimes they carried them only to feel less alone. Armies learn fast under pressure. Engineers tinkered with crystal frequency settings, and signalers learned how to turn scrap wire, even tent poles, into makeshift aerials. Still, across Italy's ridges, static ruled the airwaves. That static, those uncertain silences, inspired fear on both sides. If a radio went dead during an offensive, an entire company might vanish from the command network, left to improvise. Improvisation became survival. Sergeants often stood in for officers who had fallen. Corporals led patrols through towns pocked with sniper fire. Each day measured not by strategic breakthroughs, but by small acts of endurance. Melting snow for coffee, reusing code sheets until the ink blotted, tying splints from rifle stocks. Amid this grind, stories of ingenuity spread faster than official communiques. They traveled by word of mouth through field kitchens and Red Cross depots. A corporal who built a phone line out of wire fence, a lieutenant who redirected artillery using reflections off a mirror. The psychological strain was immense. Both sides feared being cut off more than being attacked. Isolation meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was the seed of panic. The Germans, though still disciplined, found morale eroding under constant rain, hunger, and bombing runs that shattered not just defenses, but confidence. The Americans, comparatively fresh, wrestled with terrain and experience, young soldiers learning mountain warfare the hard way. By the winter operations before Anzio, Allied command emphasized psychological warfare as much as firepower. Leaflets fluttered over enemy lines urging surrender, promising food and safe treatment. Loudspeakers mounted on jeeps shouted in German and Italian through the night, broadcasting phantom orders and false claims of encirclement. Some of these ploys worked. Others echoed unanswered across valleys filled with smoke. Within this environment of tension and illusion, new forms of combat intelligence emerged. The battlefield became not only a contest of bullets, but of nerves. Men learned that perception could kill or save as surely as any bullet. A whispered rumor of artillery nearby could be as powerful as real howitzer fire if you sold it convincingly. That February morning's broken radio ruse unfolded squarely within this space, where communication failures could turn into weapons of deception. It wasn't scripted by high command or planned in briefing tents. It grew out of desperation, out of the ingenuity of a single non-commissioned officer stranded between the lines. To grasp the impact of that moment, one must understand how a soldier like him arrived at such a place. In the winter of 1943 to 1944, central Italy sat beneath a blanket of iron and mud. The land between Cassino and the Tyrrhenian Sea was cut by rivers and gullies that drowned trucks, snapped axles, and swallowed radios whole. Towns like Aprilia, Cisterna, and Anzio became names synonymous with stalemate. Every rise in the terrain was contested. Every farmhouse risked turning into a fortress or morgue before dusk. By mid-February, the Allied foothold at Anzio had extended only a few kilometers inland. Around those fragile lodgements, pockets of mixed units operated far ahead of stable lines. Reconnaissance platoons, signal detachments, engineering teams. Orders were fluid. Front and rear blurred daily. One such detachment, drawn from a U.S. infantry division fighting under 6 Corps, had been tasked to relay forward artillery observations. Their communications sergeant was a veteran already hardened by the slow grind up the Italian peninsula. He had patched field radios under fire before, turning scrambled circuits into lifelines. His work defined the rhythm of his days. Dawn checks of channels, evening transmissions of coordinates, constant coaxing of vacuum tubes against the cold. Radios hummed like nervous hearts amid the explosions. Each squad depended on his voice to reach someone miles away. When that voice vanished in static, isolation was immediate and total. Axis troops, Germans and Italian fascist holdouts, knew this vulnerability. They listened closely for Allied transmissions, scanning frequencies, sometimes playing tricks of their own, imitating American accents, injecting fake fire orders, or taunting captured call signs. Counter-espionage manuals warned soldiers never to discuss real positions over open airwaves, but the fog of war rarely allowed perfect discipline. Amid exhaustion, mistakes carried far. In those valleys, sound itself carried differently. Artillery thunder rolled down slopes like an avalanche, so even silence had an echo. Soldiers could rarely tell where voices came from, whether an order was spoken 10 yards away or half a mile across a ravine. That acoustic confusion became a weapon for the imaginative. The sergeant's unit had advanced under cover of darkness, holding an exposed ridge to secure a radio relay position. A sudden counterattack cut them off. Shell fragments smashed the SCR-300's main antenna. The battery pack hissed. Within minutes, their one connection to higher command dropped into static. A hiss amplified by drizzle seeping into broken circuits. To retreat meant crossing open ground watched by German machine gunners. To stay meant hoping other Allied units would break through before they ran out of supplies. They chose to stay. They dug shallow foxholes among vines, patched wounds with ration wrappers, and waited. The next day, binoculars revealed an unnerving sight. Movement on the opposite ridge. A full company of Axis infantry, perhaps 200 men, organizing within view. Their own radios seemed intact. Every Allied man understood what that meant. The enemy could coordinate mortars the moment they detected movement. At such close quarters, psychological endurance overshadowed tactics. The American detachment spent the day in hushed coordination, pretending confidence they didn't feel. They whispered jokes about the radio that died of fright. When shells whistled nearby, nobody laughed. The sergeant inspected the cracked handset over and over, as if staring hard enough might revive it. He realized that although the antenna was useless, the voice transmitter still produced audible output, a faint crackle when keyed. Anyone nearby could still hear someone talking through it, though the signal went nowhere. To his men, it meant little. To the enemy listening through open terrain, it might mean everything if they believed what they heard. At that moment, an idea took seed, part instinct, part training from endless briefings on deception and morale. The front had shown him how sound shaped perception, how even rumor could paralyze men under stress. Allied intelligence officers often spoke of psychological offset, the art of making the enemy imagine a threat that didn't exist. So, when daylight thinned into smoke-colored dusk and the ridges turned to silhouettes, he prepared a performance. His props, a dented headset, a cracked microphone, and the world's most convincing improviser, fear itself. As night settled over the olive groves and faint voices carried through cold air, his plan would unfold. From this tension, the combination of broken technology, unwritten doctrine, and raw intuition, the fateful act emerged that would soon echo across both camps as the strangest surrender of that campaign. Battlefield innovations rarely arise from comfortable meetings. They emerge in the thin space between danger and exhaustion. For the American communications sergeant, there was no formal plan to deceive the enemy. Only instinct born of months watching how fear moved through men. Eyes hollowed by sleepless nights, hands raw from carrying the heavy radio up cliffs, he had long since learned that emotional control could shape reality. In the hill positions of Italy, every man was both spectator and actor in his own survival drama. The sergeant's quick improvisation came not from arrogance, but from a soldier's native creativity, the same force that taught crews to fix jeeps with wire or to brew coffee from melted snow. It was the soldier's craft of turning scarcity into method. When he lifted the broken handset to his mouth, he did so not purely to command, but to show his squad a symbol of composure. Panic, like hunger, spreads fast. To prevent it, he performed communication itself. Calm tone, deliberate words, as though entire batteries of Allied artillery waited on his call. His courage lay in the performance, not in the act of shouting orders. He understood the psychology of authority, that anyone watching, friend or foe, would respond to certainty as if it were strength. The SCR-300 was a bulky green testament to 1940s engineering. Vacuum tubes humming beneath thick metal plates, powered by fragile dry-cell batteries. Its effective range under ideal conditions spanned roughly 8 miles, but the Italian ridges seldom offered ideal. Even small damage could cripple it. Yet the radio had acquired a mystical aura among infantrymen. To be within its range was to be within civilization. To hear higher command through static was to believe rescue was near. This aura imbued the device with power beyond its circuits. The broken antenna on that ridge might have been useless to physics, but not to psychology. To Axis listeners unfamiliar with the sergeant's circumstance, a man speaking into such a set signaled organization, reinforcement, vast coordination. In modern warfare, electronics were new interpreters of intent. Spies sought frequencies not simply to intercept strategies, but to gauge morale. A busy channel meant vigor. Silence implied collapse. The sergeant inverted this logic. He broadcast illusion through gesture, not through transmission. Where wires failed, imagination completed the circuit. Italian terrain distorted both movement and hearing. Valleys acted like natural amplifiers. A sentence murmured in one hollow could be heard a mile away, depending on wind and temperature layers. Troops on both sides complained that artillery sounded closer or farther depending on echo. Military manuals of the period even warned commanders to consider topographic acoustics during deception drills. From a tactical view, the sergeant's broken radio act weaponized the landscape itself. By speaking steadily into the handset, Artillery Battery 2, coordinates grid 793, fire for effect. He composed a believable tableau for any German observer with binoculars or open ears. The assumption of imminent bombardment was enough to seed dread. Experienced officers knew that artillery, once rumored, warped entire engagements. Even the suggestion of heavy guns could cause dispersion, hesitation, or premature withdrawal. German intelligence reports from Italy often noted Allied pre-bombardment routines, patterned communications before attacks. The sergeant unknowingly replicated that rhythm, performing precisely those auditory cues. The enemy, trained to anticipate shelling after such radio chatter, drew the obvious conclusion: Allied reinforcements and batteries were zeroing in. The genius of the trick lay in its simplicity. It required no codes, no perfect translation, only the raw grammar of fear familiar to every soldier who had ever endured shell fire. The long silence between coordinates called and shells landing. These three threads, human audacity, fragile technology, and tactical sound, merged into a single act that would ripple far beyond its immediate effect. The sergeant embodied the paradox of the modern infantryman, dependent on machines, yet capable of outsmarting them when they failed. When historians later dissected incidents like this, they tended to focus on the surface. Who surrendered? Which valley? What day? But often overlooked the underlying theme. That combat innovation is rarely about new tools. It is about reframing the battlefield's perception. That morning, as the fog clung to the valley flanks, perception tilted. The American squad remained motionless, their sergeant's calm voice drifting into the gray air. Across the way, men who did not yet realize they were beaten began to imagine invisible guns drawing beads on their position. And thus began the chain reaction that would culminate in one of the most unorthodox capitulations in the Italian campaign's chronicle. A surrender summoned not by shells or bullets, but by believable sound. By the winter of 1944, the German and Italian soldiers facing the Allied lines in central Italy were not the exuberant conquerors of earlier campaigns. Most were weary veterans pulled from retreat after retreat, Sicily, Naples, and the long withdrawal up the peninsula. Conscripts filled the gaps, many scarcely 19. They were freezing, their boots worn thin, their rations reduced to hard bread and ersatz coffee. Each was told the same thing by their officers: hold the ridges, no matter what. But beneath that slogan, morale trembled. Rumors of overwhelming Allied manpower circled nightly. Hundreds of tanks. Americans with endless artillery. Such whispers carried deadly psychological weight. The soldiers observed how Allied air power ruled daylight. Whenever radio chatter hinted at guns being moved up, instinct told them that another bombardment was imminent. Months under that strain conditioned entire companies to react reflexively to the rhythm of Allied communications. If they heard an English voice calling coordinates, they didn't wait to verify. It meant get ready for the Earth to explode. So when those Axis observers at the opposite ridge heard the American sergeant's crisp voice drifting across the valley, context did the rest. They saw one man's radio. They imagined entire batteries hidden behind the hills. One sergeant became the mouthpiece of an army they could not see. For exhausted soldiers, perception was enough. Better to surrender than endure another futile pounding. In that way, morale itself completed the sergeant's ruse. War tolerates paradox. Soldiers are taught honor and deception in the same breath. The broken radio incident sits squarely on that knife edge. Winning without shooting. Saving lives through deceit. Some might call it trickery unfit for a uniform. Others, mercy by imagination. Yet within the pragmatism of the battlefield, deception was a legitimate tactic. The Allies had entire units devoted to psychological warfare, the Ghost Army being its most elaborate expression. They inflated dummy tanks, blasted recordings of columns on the march, projected false radio traffic across Europe. In miniature, the Sergeant's Act was a perfect field application of that broader doctrine. exploit the enemy's expectations to achieve victory with minimal bloodshed. Ethically, this blurs the line between warfare and theater. Every soldier involved knew the stakes. Had the enemy realized the ruse, the small American group would have been annihilated. That razor-thin gamble underscores deception's moral balance. It protects lives when it works, but demands absolute nerve. Unlike traditional combat, psychological warfare offers no clear heroics. Only the quiet calculation that manipulation may prevent slaughter. The sergeant's calm deception spared his men and their opponents. 200 Axis troops survived instead of dying under artillery fire that never existed. In that sense, the lie served truth's higher calling, the preservation of life in a place built for taking it. One of the defining features of the Italian campaign was the decentralization of command. Mountain fighting scattered companies across terrain that no general's map could control minute to minute. Victory depended on junior leadership, sergeants, corporals, lieutenants acting on instinct. Within this framework, the non-commissioned officer became the spine of the Allied armies. His authority did not spring from formal rank, but from credibility in crisis. Men trusted those who kept composure when radio lines failed and shells whistled. Our sergeant fit that mold perfectly. When leadership is measured in heartbeats rather than orders, perception again reigns supreme. In performing his call into the broken radio, he modeled assurance. His men, watching, believed their situation less hopeless. That confidence likely projected outward as well. Body posture, discipline, quiet readiness. Observers across the valley reading those cues concluded they faced prepared soldiers under direct command of supporting artillery, not an isolated, broken detachment. Leadership in war often condenses into that intangible quality, presence. A leader's calm can function like armor. For those 200 opponents, the sergeant's presence broadcast another illusion. They were already outmaneuvered by invisible hierarchy towering above them. Belief in his authority became belief in their defeat. From the enemy's fear to the sergeant's morality and command presence, each factor converged upon one principle. Warfare is an interpretive exchange. Combatants interpret limited signals under immense emotional pressure, and out of those fragments, they construct reality. The broken radio surrendered 200 soldiers not because of superior technology or numbers, but because it manipulated interpretation. Each side saw what it needed to see. The Americans, hope of backup. The Axis, proof of encirclement. Within that mirrored psychology, an illusion replaced combat. These interwoven angles formed the foundation for the incident's final escalation. The point when imagination overwhelmed gunpowder, and a single voice through static achieved what heavy artillery could not. And as the gray dawn returned over the ridges, history leaned toward its turning point. Dawn crept over the valley like a cautious scout. Frost glazed the olive leaves, glittering faintly each time distant flares pulsed above the horizon. The 12 Americans on the ridge had barely slept. One had counted more than 60 German voices muttering below through the night. The small detachment's trench network was shallow, their ammunition half gone. The radio, still broken beyond all repair, sat on its side beside the sergeant, an inert companion. At first light, movement stirred on the opposite slope. Gray-clad figures repositioned, digging in deeper. Through his binoculars, the sergeant saw machine guns being emplaced, a mortar team aligning tubes. It meant only one thing: the counterattack was coming. He exhaled slowly and glanced at his radio, the useless weight that had once tied them to existence. He checked again that the handset's connector still produced that faint crackle when keyed. His men thought he was simply testing it. In truth, he was rehearsing a performance that would decide whether they lived another hour. At 07:45 hours, streaks of gold light broke through the mist. The sergeant crouched behind a low wall, lifted the handset to his mouth, and spoke evenly into the void. Fire Direction Center, this is Red 2 at grid 793. We have heavy concentration in front, requesting repeat fire pattern. Baker, stand by. Even at that cautious volume, his squad's heads turned. They knew the set was dead, but the tone of his voice was not the tone of despair. It was precise, practiced, clipped. Across the valley, the sound carried in fragments over cold air. He waited 10 seconds, then added, "Roger. Pattern confirmed. Give me 3 salvos. Delay 5 seconds each. Target marker. Smoke from farmhouse chimney. Copy that." His men exchanged glances. Some smirked nervously. One shook his head, realizing what their sergeant was attempting. A bluff audible enough for German listeners to misinterpret. The American soldiers collectively played along, loading weapons, scanning horizons as though awaiting real fire. To an enemy observer circled by uncertainty, the effect grew explosive inside the imagination. The Germans knew that before each Allied bombardment, distinctive radio orders preceded the first shell. They also knew that after such coded exchanges came silence, and then the sky fell. So when that calm American voice issued coordinates that clearly mapped their own sector, tension spiked through their lines. The German platoon commander shouted for scouts to confirm any movement behind the ridge. Within minutes, binoculars reported faint smoke near the farmhouse behind the American position. Actually, morning cooking fires from a detached British field kitchen. To nervous minds, it appeared as the smoke marker of the coming barrage. Still no shells fell, but the Germans trembled, waiting, whispering. A single misheard echo made a mortarman flinch. He thought he heard the shriek of oncoming artillery. It was only wind cutting through pines. Across the ridge, the sergeant maintained his controlled charade. "Battery, adjust right 30 meters, ready on my word. Stand by, fire when ready." He released the transmit key. Silence answered. The pause grew unbearable. For his men, it was just acting. For the enemy, the prelude to annihilation. At air weight 10 hours, a German sergeant major shouted orders to move ammunition deeper into cover. Another passed word to stand by for possible withdrawal. Conflicting commands spread like cracks in glass. Some wanted to dig in, others to retreat before shells arrived. Rear lines saw movement and assumed front trenches were already overrun. The entire defensive rhythm, months of rehearsed discipline, began dissolving under invisible pressure. In the human brain, the anticipation of bombardment often causes chaos faster than explosions themselves. Adrenaline floods the bloodstream. Decision-making narrows. Men act on fragments, not logic. Still, the American sergeant continued, calm and deliberate, calling imaginary corrections. "Battery, that's good fire. Repeat pattern, Charlie." Over. Around 08:30, confusion turned to panic. One German rifleman raised a small white towel atop his bayonet, wave trembling. Others shouted protests, "Wait for orders!" But by then, the slope had become a theater of mixed intent. No consensus, only fear. On the American side, disbelief accompanied the spectacle. Through the fog, little white shapes flickered. More towels, helmets held up. Finally, hands raised. No shot had been fired. The sergeant lowered his handset and blinked into the impossible image before him. The ruse had worked not because of perfect German translation, but because of a universal language. The cold logic of survival. 200 soldiers, certain death minutes away, surrendered to silence. As the captives began descending with arms in the air, the 12 Americans looked at one another as if trying to confirm reality. Recognized an opportunity. Their sergeant gave a short laugh, half relief, half astonishment. He rose, dusted mud from his uniform, and muttered something his men would repeat for decades. "Guess the old set still has range." But the situation was not yet resolved. White flags could always mask ambush. The squad stayed guarded while gathering the prisoners, signaling toward distant Allied lines with flares. Within that tense half-hour before confirmation arrived, history balanced on a thread. Because a single misstep could still turn triumph into tragedy. And as the first groups of surrendered Axis troops filed upward, blinking through the rising daylight, The operation's true magnitude revealed itself. An entire company undone by a voice and the myth of artillery thunder that never came. The valley was eerily quiet. The normal percussion of small arms fire had vanished, replaced by the creak of boots on loose stones and the low clatter of discarded rifles. The surrender was sudden, almost theatrical. Dozens, then hundreds of Axis troops converging along the narrow trail that led into the American perimeter. The sergeant held his hand up, palm outward, signaling ceasefire to his own men, though no shots had been exchanged. He advanced cautiously, weapon slung but ready, voice steady. Keep them moving, keep them visible. His dozen soldiers, dazed yet disciplined, spread along the wall line as prisoner after prisoner crossed over. The first German officer approached with his helmet in hand, the crisp black and silver insignia dulled by mud. He attempted to salute before realization struck that surrender carried different etiquette. In halting English, he asked whether bombardment would resume. The sergeant, hiding a wry smile, replied matter-of-factly, "That depends how fast you stack those weapons." From that moment, the scene shifted from tension to surreal efficiency. The Americans collected rifles, sidearms, even a few machine guns. Captured maps confirmed what the sergeant's instinct had guessed. The Germans had expected shelling at any moment, and seeing no route of escape behind them, chose capitulation as the lesser hell. By 09:30 hours, over 200 prisoners sat beneath makeshift guard within the farmhouse courtyard. The small American squad had multiplied its number nearly 20-fold, without a single casualty. When reinforcements finally arrived from the next valley, their first assumption was a misunderstanding. The captain asked how many artillery pieces had participated. When told none, he thought it a joke. Witness accounts differ slightly on the finer details, but several official after-action reports survive. In Vicor dispatches from February 44, one entry records, enemy force, approx. 200, surrendered to small forward element after receiving impression of imminent heavy fire support. It adds dryly, no artillery fired. Such understatement conceals the extraordinary psychology at play. The German prisoners later confirmed under interrogation what the Americans suspected. They had overheard radio commands for artillery fire spoken clearly in English, and assumed Allied formations were hidden just beyond their line of sight. One corporal reportedly told an interpreter, "We expected the ground to open. We saw smoke and thought rangefinders had us marked." None dared to test that assumption. In broader military terms, the event illustrated how utterly critical perception had become in 20th century warfare. Machines allowed armies to project presence far beyond physical reach. Radio static, aircraft noise, even simple rumor generated disproportionate effect. The sergeant's trick condensed that entire philosophy into one 30-minute performance. It was not formal psychological operations, merely the instantaneous exploitation of fear. The first Allied intelligence officers to interview him were incredulous. They examined the broken SCR-300 set as though it contained hidden transmitters. The cracked antenna sagged pitifully. The tube assembly was indeed beyond repair. One inspector reportedly quipped, "If only all our dead radios worked half as well." In the days that followed, the incident traveled along command gossip networks, embellished in retelling, yet the core remained unchanged. No gunfire, mass surrender. One calm voice. The sergeant himself resisted any labored explanation. He described it simply as bluffing on the battlefield. His men, however, emphasized the atmosphere. That mix of dread, silence, and the almost supernatural power of suggestion that swept through the valley. Among the prisoners marched out later that evening was a young German lieutenant who, when asked what prompted him to give up, replied, "Because I wished to live 5 minutes longer." Your guns, they were already aimed. Whether honest fear or retrospective justification, his words captured the essence of the episode. On that morning, imagination replaced artillery. Strategically, the surrender cleared a crucial approach, enabling Allied forces to secure higher ground without expenditure of ammunition. Logistically, it freed an entire battery for other engagements, but its deeper resonance lay elsewhere, in the understanding that human psychology could tip the scale more swiftly than firepower. As the prisoners were columned down the muddy slope, the Americans lounged behind stone terraces, half relief, half disbelief. One private tore the antenna from the ruined radio and planted it upright in the rubble like a trophy, muttering that it should qualify for combat pay. Evening descended with a light drizzle. The valley, once a cauldron of noise, quieted to distant artillery murmurs echoing 20 miles south. The sergeant finally sat alone, inspecting the scuffed handset that had turned the tide. For a long minute he studied its silent faceplate, thumb tracing the chipped paint over the word Signal Corps U.S. Army. He tucked it into his pack, not as equipment, but as relic. That night's official log entry closed succinctly. Position held. No casualties. Enemy surrendered under misconception of encirclement. It sounded bureaucratic enough, yet behind those sterile words lay the full absurdity and brilliance of the event. A tactical victory born from broken machinery and a man's capacity to improvise courage. The entire episode would ripple outward into legend, finding its way into after-action briefings and academic discussions about acoustic deception. For those who witnessed it, however, it needed no theory. They had seen persuasion stronger than firepower, an echo sever stronger than shell burst. When dawn broke the following day, and Allied columns moved through the captured ridge, the sergeant's exhausted men could finally laugh. They joked about promotion requests for talking the enemy to death. Yet even in laughter they sensed the gravity of what had happened, because war had momentarily bent toward life instead of death. The following morning, the valley looked almost peaceful. Too peaceful for a place that had flirted with annihilation hours before. Frost still clung to the stone walls, dew glimmered on rifles stacked neatly by the surrendered Germans. Allied photographers arrived after sunrise to record the improbable scene. A dozen mud-caked Americans, 200 dispirited prisoners, and one battered radio at the center, perched like a forgotten artifact of a different war. When reports reached the nearest divisional headquarters, skepticism came first. The colonel reviewing the preliminary field message jotted a terse pencil note. Request confirmation. 200? No engagement? Verification teams were dispatched. They interviewed witnesses, examined the terrain, compared times. Everything aligned. The surrender had occurred with negligible resistance. No gunfire, no artillery registration, pure capitulation. Within days, staff officers categorized the event under morale exploitation, a catch-all term for spontaneous psychological successes. It joined the footnotes of operations summaries alongside statistics of tonnage and ammunition used, which, in this case, read none. But among the men on the front, the tale took on momentum far beyond paperwork. Word spread through mess tents and bivouacs like a folk legend. A sergeant bluffed a whole company, they whispered. Talked them into quitting. Propaganda officers. The Army's Information Service drafted a short internal bulletin describing resourcefulness and courage under pressure. It omitted names, partly for security, partly to prevent an accidental celebrity, but the message was clear. Initiative saves lives. The sergeant's anonymity didn't diminish the power of his story. In fact, it amplified it. He became an archetype, the inventive American NCO who turned failure into triumph. Historians later sought to verify specific details, exact coordinates, unit numbers, prisoner counts. Official archives point toward incidents clustered near the Anzio beachhead. February 1944, involving the U.S. 45th Feeder Infantry Division and adjacent signal elements under VI. Corps. Interviews collected in post-war oral histories confirm at least one event matching the description, a communicative bluff that prompted an entire German company to surrender without direct combat. Some historians argue it happened slightly inland near the town of Caracito. Others suggest a smaller engagement absorbed by confusion in field records. The precise map location matters less than the confirmed pattern. American forward personnel improvising psychological ruses to compel surrender. The broken radio episode aligned perfectly with documented trends. In Italy especially, where terrain magnified rumor, many micro-encounters depended on whoever could project confidence first. For the sergeant and his men, the recognition arrived quietly. Field commendations cited exceptional initiative resulting in capture of enemy personnel and preservation of American lives. No parade followed. They were folded back into the endless rhythm of patrols, repairs, and supply runs. Yet, among neighboring units, their ridge earned a new nickname, Radio Hill. The moral ripple extended beyond Army camps. Intelligence sections analyzed the affair to refine leafleting and loudspeaker tactics. Psychologists studying combat behavior later referenced such events as proof that belief can dissolve organized resistance faster than brute force. Decades after the war, veterans attending reunions would recall that Italy produced fighter aces and tank duels, but also victories spoken into existence by words. Perhaps the strongest validation came from the former enemy. Interviews held in 1946 with captured German officers revealed mixed emotions: admiration, embarrassment, relief. One lieutenant admitted, "The voice was too calm. We thought, if those men are that certain, they must be supported by many others." His sentence encapsulated the entire geometry of the surrender. The perception of certainty promulgated through static. In an age before digital deception, that morning served as a lesson written in mud. Confidence, amplified by circumstance, could outweigh materiel. The soldiers who had lived it moved on to other fronts. But the story of the voice through the ruined radio lingered in official and unofficial memory alike, a quiet emblem of imagination's power. At headquarters, a final notation added to the operations ledger read simply, "Enemy surrender achieved via simulated artillery communication." Nothing more. No flourish. Yet behind those few words stood the full theater of that valley, and a moment when survival depended not on superior weapons, but on superior nerve. From these verified records and recollections, a broader set of consequences began to crystallize. The lessons that generals, historians, and psychologists would draw for years afterward. The story of the broken radio was small in scale, yet seismic in meaning. Within the Allied command, it became illustrative shorthand for how modern warfare had shifted. Victories no longer hinged solely on tonnage of shells or divisions deployed. They increasingly pivoted on perception, information, and the human responses these shaped. Intelligence officers dissected the incident as a micro-case of acoustic deception, grouping it with experiments that were then underway in France and England, projects that used sound to conjure entire phantom armies. Such connections were not accidental. Allied planners had already begun recognizing that mental and sensory deception could conserve both lives and material. The Ghost Army, activated the following year in northern France, would employ inflatable tanks, sound trucks, and false radio nets precisely to achieve on a grand scale what one sergeant had done by instinct in the hills of Italy. He became, without ever receiving formal credit, an early practitioner of the same philosophy. Strategically, the Italian episode underscored a recurring wartime paradox. The closer technology drew armies to perfect destruction, the more valuable imagination became as a tool of survival. Radios, meant to coordinate fire, could equally broadcast illusions. Antennas that failed mechanically could still function psychologically. This inversion delighted analysts and unnerved purists, for it suggested that discipline of thought mattered as much as discipline of engineering. Ethically, the discussion ran deeper. Traditionalists wondered whether inspiring an enemy to surrender through deception diluted valor. Yet many officers embraced it as moral economy. Victory without massacre. Colonel Elliot M. Simons, a U.S. Army ethics instructor who studied the case post-war, wrote, "Deception that averts slaughter is no less honorable than courage that endures it." His words found quiet resonance among combat veterans for whom every spared life weighed heavier than abstract notions of glory. For German historians after 1945, the surrender pointed to the cumulative exhaustion of Axis forces in Italy. It revealed not cowardice, but realism. The rational decision of soldiers whose faith in higher command had already thinned. They were not broken by one man's bluff alone. He merely provided the final narrative that allowed them to stop fighting. In that sense, the broken radio symbolized the entire Italian campaign. Stubborn resistance eroded not by annihilation, but by attrition of belief. Among American troops, the episode lived on as a parable told around field stoves whenever new replacements arrived. Veterans used it to teach a simple creed: keep a level head, use every scrap of circumstance, and never underestimate your voice's power amid panic. The sergeant's legend became a practical manual of leadership. Communicate confidence even when none is left to feel. Decades later, oral historians tracked down surviving members of the squad. Most were reluctant to grandstand. One, by then a retired schoolteacher, summarized the moment with rural understatement. "We just told them what they already feared." "No, bro," another added, "we didn't outfight them. We outran their imagination." Those phrases, half humor, half philosophy, distilled the real legacy more effectively than any citation. Military academies incorporated the anecdote into lectures on morale and information warfare. In slide decks about strategic communication, the unnamed sergeant stood beside far larger operations such as Fortitude South and Quicksilver, the deceptive maneuvers preceding D-Day. His act echoed there not as quaint curiosity, but as prototype, the smallest unit-level victory fabricated entirely from tone, context, and conviction. By the war's end, its official footprint remained modest, a line in a ledger, a mention in a Signal Corps newsletter, but its quiet influence extended far. It taught that technology, however advanced, always filtered through the human element. A machine's power still depends on whoever dares to repurpose its failure into possibility. When historians revisit the Italian campaign, they often pause at that footnote about 200 Axis troops surrendering to a handful of Americans. Some interpret it as satire amid tragedy, others as sublime chance. Yet everyone agrees that the event distilled an enduring lesson of modern warfare. Even in the machine age, the mind remains the most decisive weapon. From this recognition, the reflection emerges naturally. How that one fleeting act reshaped ideas of courage, communication, and the quiet humanity possible within the world's most violent endeavor. War amplifies the voice of destruction until it drowns almost everything else. Yet, within that roar, history sometimes pauses for a whisper. And it is the whisper that endures. The sergeant's makeshift performance on that Italian ridge remains one of those rare pauses when intellect triumphed over instinct, when presence overcame panic, and when the art of communication itself became a shield. His weapon was nothing more than tone and timing. The cracked radio, useless by technical measure, became a stage from which a single mind repelled an entire company. In an age defined by noise, planes, artillery, politics, it was silence and suggestion that carried the day. It reminds us that technology in war is never only about circuitry or steel. It is about interpretation. Every machine only magnifies the imagination of its operator. The surrender that unfolded had no heroic charge, no cinematic crescendo. It was a moment of stillness where both sides glimpsed the absurd edge of their struggle. One man pretending to call fire, hundreds choosing not to die. In that instant, the vast industrial war revealed a fragment of human sanity, a collective decision, however coerced by fear, to live. Modern militaries would go on to mechanize deception into doctrine, but none of those large operations possess the same fragile beauty as this accidental experiment in human understanding. It showed that courage can reside not in pulling a trigger, but in believing words might suffice. When we picture that ridge now, mist thinning, rifles stacked, one soldier holding a silent handset, we glimpse more than cunning. We see the enduring contradiction at the heart of warfare, that even amid its machinery, the outcome turns on empathy, nerve, and imagination.